excited to be back. So after our last video, we had talked about doing our primer layer on everything on your Sculpt or your Christopher kit if you're using a Bountiful Baby kit. We have got this little peanut primed and ready to go. Once you get done, that's where you're going to go back using your cosmetic wedge. If you don't want to use the cosmetic wedge, the other thing I do is I will use a brush. This one is a makeup brush. This is the e.l.f. makeup brush. I really like this one because it leaves such a cool texture, but it leaves a really nice texture on the vinyl without having any kind of lines. So I will figure out the name of this brush for later. The other thing I learned, which was really interesting, and trying to figure out the painting method compared to what I'm used to. Like with Genesis, for an example, I'm used to mixing up a nice big batch of my washes and I have them at ready whenever I need them. You can intermix the Genesis with Irresistibles, by the way. Well, I thought I would try to do that using my LiquiThin, not just LiquiThin, but using the Irresistibles. And that did not work quite as well as I originally expected. It ended up leaving too much product on, so that method does not work real great with the Irresistibles. You got to kind of get used to that. And that's why it could have been having issues with that previous kit that we were working on that had cracked so horribly. That was because we had way too much paint on there. It was way too thick. After talking with Esther, it makes sense. I went back and we had done some more experimenting with what we can do with color. That is where I had to change my approach with doing my washes and getting rid of this. I'm gonna hang on to this, so I'll use like a pipette, mix with some of this into my other paints. But for now, I'm just gonna leave it aside, but I won't be using that. I'm gonna use straight pigment with my LiquiThin. And I wanna show you the consistency that you're gonna need. So the first layer, and I wanna show you this too. This is the palette that I've made with the Irresistibles. This is all using the primary colors. And this one here is the thick medium. I will often take from these colors and add into my other color that I'm gonna make. And then when I'm done using it, I will scrape it into one of these wells so that I'm not wasting my product. I'm just gonna scoot that aside. I like using this glass dish. One will help show you how much product you are using and how much you really need versus seeing it on a well. So I'm gonna use this and we're gonna get started. So with this peanut, the first layer that we wanna do is I'm gonna do a texture layer and we're gonna use our primary red with the Irresistibles. With the red, I'm gonna use this texture right through here and kind of see how cool that is. We can make these super easy. For the sake of time, I'm not gonna do that on camera. Maybe I'll make another video just dedicated on how we can make different tools that will work with this. I'm gonna get our primary red. I like to use a round brush. It's just personal preference when I'm getting started. Or you can use your Squeegee. So I just move my paint around and that's actually too much. See how much that is? It's just a small amount. Maybe just a tiny bit more. Okay, that is all I want. And then I don't know if you guys have seen my other videos, but I clean my brushes off using my washes so that I don't waste anything. Then I'll end up just diluting it with more thinner. So food for that. Okay, so we've got that. Now the one thing with this, with your LiquiThin, is that less is more, okay? You're only gonna need about the same amount of LiquiThin as to the amount of pigment you're using. So it's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. So I'm just gonna do a few drops. Maybe one more. Just enough to cover that amount of color that you're working with. And because I'm gonna do more of a texture, I want to also thin it out. And oh, the thing I wanted to tell you too is mix your pigment with your LiquiThin before mixing it with just thinner. I've noticed it is a lot more creamy and has a nice consistency when you mix it in your LiquiThin first and then add the thinner, if you choose to use thinner as well. But like, this is a perfect type of consistency for doing blushing or some small details, but because we're going to do that texture, we don't want it to be that pigmented. So we're going to dilute that out, and I'm going to add about 5 drops of my thinner. And we're gonna mix that up. To me, this is crazy thinking that this is gonna be enough to do the entire kit. And believe me when I say it is, it really is. I'm so used to pre-mixing my color into big jars and having that ready for whenever I need it. So that is going to be kind of a thing I got to get used to, where I'm not going to mix quite as much paint all at once. You want to make sure you're mixing enough to do whatever you're doing, so you don't have to mix halfway through, because if you end up having to remix halfway through, your pigment's going to be a little bit off. Now I want to add just another drop or two into pigment here. There. That's plenty. So you can see just how thin we want this to be. You don't want it really watery, but you don't want it real creamy either. You want it in between that consistency and mix really, really, really well. I like to use this squeegee. I'll put a link in the description on where you can find squeegees like this. I have my dedicated red brush that I use for mixing. I just wipe it off my squeegee so that I'm not wasting. And then what we're gonna do is you're gonna just pick up some of this color, and you're not gonna press real down hard. You're just gonna lightly kind of glaze over the top of your sponge, and it will feel like you're not really picking up anything, and that you almost get really tempted to really get in there and start pouncing. But then what happens is that color is gonna get absorbed into your sponge, and more of your color that you've made will be left in the sponge versus on the kit. So by glazing over the top of that texture, you'll be able to have that color stretch a lot further. All right, I'm going to start with the back of the kit, and we're very lightly going to be going over everything. You can see how light it is. It's very fair. It's a nice consistency. It's going to be perfect for building up layers. And when you want to get behind the ears, I use like the back of my cosmetic wedge. I use the longer portion of that angle, and I press it in behind the ear, and then I go right on top and then in center. So we've got about a quarter of that head done. So I'm just going to pick up a little bit more color. It has been so fun and such a learning experience, but I got to tell you, it is a completely different way of painting than I'm used to with Genesis. Genesis, I feel like, one, you definitely have to do more layers, and two, you can mix a lot more of your pigment early on, where with the Irresistibles, you only mix what you need when you need it, and it goes so far and works so nicely. I'm gonna go underneath. The harder the pressure you apply with your sponge, the more intense that color will be left behind. But I don't want it intense. I want to have very light layers so that I can build it up over time and not have it too thick. Now, the other thing you can do is, usually once I get started and I have like some of my pigment where I've already picked it up, I'll go over that area just tapping very lightly. I won't go into the thick of it, but I'll just go into the area that I've kind of spread my pigment out, and then I can pounce real lightly to pick up color. And then we're gonna keep on keeping on, and I'm twisting my sponge And so that way, when the pigment is put down on the vinyl, it's going to have more of that random pattern to it. Now, if you, let's say you do it too thick and you don't like it, it looks way too bold, you can go over and soften it. Like on the bottom here, it's a little bold for me, so I'm gonna take my brush or whatever kind of brush you wanna use. I like these Eco Tools brushes. They're real short foundation because the bristles are really firm, and I use that as a dry brush. And I go over those areas, blotting out what I have put down, and then you can see how it leaves kind of more of a blotchiness to it versus just little defined prints. Does that make sense? It softens everything out. So I like to do a couple of layers where I will end up going over it with the sponge, just so that I can give it that blotchiness underneath the layers. And I always work from the back going towards the front, trying to make sure I keep my hands out of view. And everything we're gonna do with this series is gonna be using our primary colors. So that way I can kind of show you how I mix colors and ratios and all of that fun stuff. So you really don't need any pre-mixed colors right now, but we can get into that later. Okay, you're gonna go over the entire face. And I always like to kind of go in a circle, kind of enclosing in on the face. And then when I get to the nose, I kind of do a rocking motion over the nose and over the upper lip so that I can get in there really good. Okay. So you can see how when I put my texture down, I am applying the next stamp, almost overlapping the previous one, so that it's gonna leave that nice texture, but there's no kind of areas that are unpainted. Then I'm gonna finish taking my dry brush and I'm gonna go over that with my dry brush to blot it out. That'll give it more of that blotchiness that we want underneath the surface of the skin. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I see a little area I want to go right at the upper lip here. I must have put a little too much pressure through there. Once I do that, I will take my fine liner and I will use that to go over the creases. And I'll do the creases maybe like 3 times. I've noticed that if you go too much, you may have cracking in those creases because too much color has built up on itself. And that's just because you don't need as much pigment for the Irresistibles line, where Genesis you need to build more pigment up over time. So I'm just gonna go around the nose, get around those nostrils. I'm gonna go underneath the nose there, in the center. I'm gonna go right on the outside of the ear there. Right there. I go through the top of the ear and around the back. And this is where I'll probably switch out. I really need to switch out to a little bit bigger brush for these larger areas, but it works really good for the smaller areas. So you can see the amount of paint that I'm using. I'm really using virtually nothing. And then for this, you're just basically, I'll take my texture sponge and I'll go over those areas just to soften it out a little bit. And then I'm gonna go to the back of the ear. There's like this crease through here. And I'm gonna hit it with this lovely thing. And then I'm gonna go in this crease underneath the chin. And this area, it's not really a crease, it's more of an indentation, but because I want to build that up, I'm gonna just hit that a little bit through here. And then we're gonna go in the ear canal Making sure that you drag that color up through every edge of the ear. I'm going to drag it all the way around on the inside portion of the ear, and then I'm going to go up through here. Bring that up through here. Now you could paint the entire ear and blot it out if you wanted to do that as your first layer, or you can do what I'm doing and just apply it in certain areas. It's almost considered like an absence of color painting method. Sue Ellen Teratoma talks a lot about that in her tutorials, which if you haven't checked them out, I would highly recommend checking hers out. It's a very affordable subscription to her Patreon, and you definitely will learn a lot. All right. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to do the other ear. Trying to keep reminding myself to keep my hand out of view. Okay, dragging that up the edge. Going through here. Gonna bring that up through the underside. And I'm just gonna go through the top. Now, the one thing that I also realized is that originally we were told that it's not necessary to wait for your paints to flash. It's not like Genesis, where for those of you that are brand new and don't know basically what flashing is when you're using your thinner and you're waiting for the thinner to kind of evaporate, leaving just the pigment behind. But I have also learned that what happens is if you have built up color too much in any particular area, it's going to have a little bit of a white layer to it. When that happens, then I will go over those areas with my dry brush to get rid of any of that excess color that may have gotten built up there. And I noticed that by allowing it to flash, I'm able to see that a lot more clear than go ahead and baking and then find later that those areas got too thick and they start looking like they're cracking or losing color. It's because you have too much pigment in those areas. Go ahead and let it flash and then go back over those areas with your dry brush to get rid of some of that white that's left behind. And once the white is gone, you know that you are at a good amount of pigment and you can go ahead and bake at that point. I am just getting another brush. Everything in my soul wants me to play with the Genesis with this. I really want to just focus on what Irresistibles can do and the painting style that is a little different with Irresistibles than it is with your other lines. And I love angled brushes for when you're working in the nose because it can get the edges of the nostril on the inside and you're just doing a tapping motion. And tap, tap, tap. It'll get every edge really nicely versus just going in with the brush and kind of spinning the brush because it doesn't really get the color on all of the edging really good. By using an angled brush, you're able to get in there and paint the sides a lot easier by doing a tapping method. So tap, tap, tap. The other thing is that I'm going to go over the lips, doing the creases here, dragging that up. This one's going to be a fun one to do. We're going to do a dry lip on this guy, so I'm really excited to show you that. Okay. Very, very nice. Very, very soft. Like in through here, you can kind of see how it's got a little bit more of a stronger spot. I'm just going to hit that a little bit. That looks perfect. You can already see the difference between the first layer and the flange, how much color it's actually built up. So that looks really good. we're gonna move on to the limbs. And for sake of time, I'm only gonna do one arm and one leg. And then for you guys at home, you'll continue on doing that second arm and leg on your own time. Once everything is done, you've allowed it to flash for a few minutes. See, it's already flashed. It goes so fast because we're using such a little amount of our thinner. Double check that there's no white built up anywhere. If there is, use your dry brush to get that out. And then you're gonna go ahead and make sure your oven is preheated to 265 degrees, and watch your ovens and make sure you have a thermometer in your oven. Don't trust your settings because my ovens are wonky. Like, I have to set my oven at 215 degrees to reach 265. And then after the first few minutes, I have to drop down that temperature to 213 degrees to reach 265. I've got 3 ovens, and every oven is the same way. They're all wonky temperatures. Nothing is really the true temperature that I'm punching in to actually equate 265 in the oven. So always use an oven thermometer to keep track of that. Because if your oven is not at the right temperature, your paint will not cure, and it will end up having problems in the long run, and it will cause the next layer to have problems and the next layer to have problems. So you always got to make sure that's very, very well heated to the right temperature, and you're watching it so it stays at the right temperature. And then you're gonna bake those limbs and the head at 265 degrees, 9 to 10 minutes. But after getting to know these paints, I just always will bake it at 10 minutes regardless, and if I need to go a minute or two longer, I will. I want you to go ahead and finish the head, and then we'll move on to the arms and legs, and I'll be right back. All right, we are going to move on to the leg. Just gonna mix this up a little bit. Glazing over the top of the sponge, just like we did when we did the head. So you can see that there's virtually no color that's been absorbed into the sponge, where when you're using more of that wash consistency with the Genesis, because you're using a lot more thinner and less paint and having to use more layers, oftentimes would absorb into your sponge significantly. So I'm constantly kind of wringing out my sponge, so to speak, over my jars so that I didn't waste any paint. But with Irresistibles, because of the LiquiThin, it has such a nice creamy consistency, and it keeps that pigment nice and consistent throughout your layer. You don't need to worry about losing all of that color in your sponge. So I'm going to start with the top of the limb, going through, reminding myself not to get into the view, doing that twisting motion like we did with the head, back and forth, back and forth. We are essentially overlapping our stamping, going through the back of the leg. I always keep a little tweezer handy, because sometimes you'll get little hairs or a little fleck of dust or something that if you end up painting over it and then baking, that's going to be stuck in that layer, and over time, if you consistently do that, it's going to look kind of wonky. So be careful with that. And then to get in the back of your limb, with these sponges, they have, one side is a little bit longer than the other, so I will use the longer side to get towards that crease, so that way I can get as close as I possibly can without having affected the areas that I've already put the pigment down. I'm gonna go over everything. I always like to just go up and down so that I can keep track of where I'm at. I'll do my foot last. Add a little bit more pigment. You can see that we've got quite a bit left on our palette here, and we only have one other leg and the 2 arms to do. So it goes a long way. Making sure that I didn't miss anything. Now I'm gonna go over the foot. Flipping my sponge over to use that longer spot again to get into those smaller areas. And I kind of go over the toes in a rocking motion, getting in the crease as best I can, and then using your sponge from under the toes and rocking up. And then on the bottom of the foot, just doing your normal stamping. Make sure you're doing the edge of the foot, your heel. Okay. Then go back with our dry brush and we're gonna pounce it out a little bit. That's just gonna soften that layer because I want it to be more blotchy underneath this next layer than having any kind of vivid stamp or marking or texture, whatever you want to call it. We just want it to be a soft blotchiness. And you can do as much or as little as you want. I mean, if you like that appearance of having much more vivid texture, then go for it. If you want it to be more soft, then keep pouncing it out till it's to the point where you like it. You can already see only one layer, and look at the difference between the flange and the actual limb. Irresistible's pigment is perfect. It just builds up so nicely, so you won't have to do nearly as much layers. Now we're gonna go over the creases, and again, this one is more of a round brush. I don't have the specific name for this one, but you can kind of see what it looks like. Works quite well. I'm gonna go in the back of the leg here, and I'm gonna do these little creases along the thigh, and we go behind the heel. You like my music? Across the front of the foot. I'm gonna go between the creases through the toes. Hit the creases on the top of the toes. Oftentimes I will do that underneath the magnifying glass, and I will use a smaller liner brush to get in those creases. And bottom of the foot. And I don't do every single crease either when I'm doing my creases when it comes to like the bottom of the foot, because they're so wrinkly, and that I've noticed in the past when I would do every single crease that my creases would start looking dirty over time because it just had too much buildup on it. So now I allow the pigment to build up it naturally on it when you're doing your texture, and it will settle in those creases a little bit, but it will look a lot more nice. And then I'm going to use my dry brush, and I'm going to hit those creases just to soften those areas out. I'm just going to hit the tops of the toes, and I'm going to go underneath the toes. I always like to do the toes a few times because they always are the hardest to take color and takes longer to build up. Got a little much on that part, and that's okay. I'm not worried about it. So I can blot that out. Just gonna tap it a little bit right through here. Okay, so our leg is done. I'm only gonna do the one leg, and then you guys at home will continue on doing your second limb, and then we're going to do the arm. We're gonna do the arm the same fashion. I'm gonna pick up that color. And then, if you're having trouble holding your limb, I would recommend keeping your dowel or a dowel close by, and then you can keep it in the limb, which I do oftentimes when we have these small areas, so that it's easier to hang on to. I'm gonna go just like I did with the leg, doing that overlapping motion with the twisting motion, making sure that I get right at the edge of the flange. Add just a little bit more pigment. You will find that by the time you get done all of your limbs and the head, you will have used pretty much most of your color, and that's where I'll take my squeegee if there is any extra, and I put it in my other paint well so that I can use it when I'm mixing other colors if I need to. But there's rarely, I've noticed, much left. It's like a perfect amount to do that layer for the arm. With the curves of the fingers and things like that, I kind of do that rocking motion. And you're gonna get into those fingers as well. Don't leave like a ridge so it looks like it's just on the top of the finger and not on the edges or the side. Using our round brush, I'm gonna go ahead and do those creases. And do the wrist, palm of the hand, through those fingers, underneath, and I'm going to hit the tops of the fingertips. If it gets on the nail bed, it's not a big deal. You can use that as your base color when you do the nail tips, and we'll get to that later. Okay, now taking our dry brush and blotting that out. And you can either do your creases first, or you can do the overall limb first. It's really up to you. There's no right or wrong way. Okay. Just making sure that we don't have anything settling in any of those creases. That looks good. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna bake this layer. And when we get back after baking this layer, we're gonna move on to our next color. Stay tuned. Make sure you come to the next video to check out what we're gonna be doing and watch these little babies come to life. I really appreciate you guys hanging out and watching and learning. And please let me know if there's something in particular that you have questions about, or any feedback you might have in the comments. It really helps me out, and it also helps you guys. Make sure you like and subscribe and hit the little bell so you get notified when the videos get uploaded for the next time. I'm trying to do the best I can so that way there'll be a video coming out every couple weeks. So hopefully we'll have this doll put together in no time. But thanks for watching, you guys. I really appreciate each and every one of you. Have a great rest of your day.